I woke up one morning to find my life flipped upside down, not by a storm, not by a break-in, but by the very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood, my HOA. Imagine walking outside and seeing your driveway chained shut, your mailbox ripped out of the ground, and strangers in your yard snapping photos of your house like they owned it. That's exactly what happened to me. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, a mix-up. But then the letters started showing up. Threats disguised as violations. Fines stacking up higher than a mortgage. Every time I fixed one thing, they invented something new. Paint too faded, grass too long. Even the color of my curtains wasn't approved. And right at the center of it all, a woman with a clipboard, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and a mission to break me down. Now, I had a choice. Pay up, give in, or fight back against an entire system designed to crush anyone who steps out of line. So what do you do when your own neighbors become your enemies? When the Martins first moved into Willow Creek Estates, they thought they'd finally found it. The kind of neighborhood you see in glossy brochures. Rows of tidy homes, kids riding bikes without a care, neighbors waving from across the street. After years of renting in cramped apartments, John and Lisa were excited to put down roots. Their two kids, Emily and Jack, finally had a backyard big enough for a swing set and a scruffy golden retriever named Max. Life in those first few months felt almost too good to be true. Every morning, John would sip his coffee on the porch while the kids waited for the school bus at the corner. Lisa loved tending her small garden, proudly showing off her rows of bright sunflowers and tomatoes. On weekends, the family grilled in the backyard, the smell of burgers drifting over the fence as Max chased the kids around the lawn. It was the kind of simple, ordinary happiness they had been chasing for years. A quiet street, good schools, a place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. The Martins believed they had found their safe haven. And for a while, they blended right in. They waved at neighbors, went to a few cookouts, and even attended the HOA's welcome meeting, a friendly, almost too polite gathering where rules were rattled off between slices of cake and punch. At the time, none of it seemed serious. Who really cared about the height of a mailbox or the shade of beige on a garage door? But looking back, John remembered feeling something odd that night. The way the HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen, watched him as if measuring every word he said. The way she flipped through her clipboard like it was a weapon disguised as paper. He brushed it off then. He had no idea what was coming. For now, life was smooth. Emily joined the soccer team, Jack started building a tree house with his dad, Lisa painted the kitchen her favorite pale blue and started hosting small book club nights. The Martins weren't looking for trouble, they just wanted to live in peace. But little cracks were already forming under the perfect surface of Willow Creek. A neighbor's friendly reminder about garbage cans left out too long, a note tucked under their doormat about the unsightly swing set in the backyard. Harmless things at first glance, easy to ignore. Still, John couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching, that their home, their sanctuary, wasn't fully theirs. And when the first official letter arrived from the HOA, cold, clipped, and demanding action, the Martins realized the dream they bought into came with a price. They had no way of knowing just how high that price would be.
The first letter had felt like a nuisance, a warning about the Martins' trash cans being visible from the street. John had laughed it off, thinking it was some clerical mix-up. After all, everyone on Willow Creek left their bins by the curb overnight. Why single them out? He crumpled the letter, tossed it in the trash, and went on with his evening. But the second letter wasn't so easy to ignore. This time, the HOA accused them of having an unapproved structure. The kids' swing set in the backyard. Lisa had saved for months to buy that set. She'd even painted it a cheerful sky blue to match the shutters on their house. From their perspective, it wasn't just a swing set. It was part of the childhood they had always wanted to give their kids. The HOA didn't see it that way. The letter gave them 10 days to remove it or face fines of $200 per day until it was gone. John felt his stomach twist. "It's in the backyard," he argued. "Nobody even sees it unless they're snooping." That was when he realized the truth. Someone was watching. At first, he tried to play it calm. He went to the next HOA meeting, papers in hand, ready to reason with the board. He spoke about family, about kids needing a safe place to play. He thought common sense would win the day. But as he stood in that brightly lit community room, every pair of eyes seemed to glare at him like he was on trial. And there she was, Karen, the president, sitting tall with her clipboard like a judge waiting to pass sentence. When John finished his plea, she didn't hesitate. "Rules are rules," she said flatly. "If we make an exception for you, we'll have to make exceptions for everyone. That's not how we keep our community beautiful." The room was silent. Then someone coughed. A neighbor he barely knew whispered something into another's ear, and they both smirked. That night, John drove home with the windows down, but he couldn't shake the heat building in his chest. He looked at the swing set, at the joy it brought his kids, and he swore he wouldn't take it down. That was the moment the war began. The fines started piling up within days. First $200, then $400, then $1,000. Each notice felt colder, harsher, more threatening. They warned of liens, lawsuits, even foreclosure. The Martins weren't just fighting over a swing set anymore. They were fighting for their home. Then came the harassment. Small, needling things that chipped away at their peace. A letter claiming Lisa's sunflowers were non-compliant vegetation. A notice saying the color of their shutters didn't meet community standards, even though they'd been the same color since move-in. Worst of all, the mysterious complaints. Someone said Max, their dog, barked too loudly at night. Someone else claimed their trash bins smelled. And John knew what it meant. The neighbors had turned against them, or worse, were too afraid of the HOA to stand with them. Every time John drove down Willow Creek Lane, he felt eyes peering out from behind curtains. Friends who used to wave now looked away. It was as if the Martins had been branded with a scarlet letter. Troublemakers. And the kids? They felt it too. Emily's best friend wasn't allowed to come over anymore. Jack got teased at school about his illegal swing set. Lisa cried quietly at night, worrying they'd made a terrible mistake moving here. And John's frustration hardened into resolve. He wasn't going to let Karen or anyone scare his family out of the life they had worked for. But the HOA wasn't done, not even close. The next blow landed on a sunny Saturday morning. John was mowing the lawn when he noticed a man in a polo shirt snapping photos of his house. "Hey," he called, cutting a mower. "What are you doing?" The man looked startled, then muttered something about property inspections. He left in a hurry, but not before John caught the HOA logo on his clipboard. That week, another letter arrived. This one claimed their grass was half an inch above approved height and slapped them with another $150 fine. John slammed the letter on the kitchen table. "They're baiting us," he said. "They want us to snap, to give in." Lisa looked at him with weary eyes. "What if we can't win?" she whispered. But John couldn't back down now, not after everything they'd endured. He started documenting everything, every letter, every notice, every fine. He took photos of their lawn, their shutters, even their trash bins lined up neatly at the curb. If the HOA wanted a fight, he would fight with proof. Still, proof wasn't protection. One night, as he was locking up, he heard footsteps outside. He pulled back the curtain and saw a shadow moving near the side of the house. His heart pounded. By the time he stepped out with a flashlight, the figure was gone. Only the sound of crickets remained. The next morning, their mailbox was dented. No note, No explanation, just silence. For John, that was the turning point. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about intimidation. And if they thought he was going to roll over, they were wrong. Dead wrong. He started reaching out, first to a lawyer, then to neighbors he trusted. Quiet conversations, whispered phone calls, slowly piecing together a picture of how the HOA operated. And what he discovered shocked him. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was bending them, selectively. Neighbors she liked got away with things far worse than a swing set or sunflowers. The family across the street had a trampoline visible from the road. No fines. Another house had shutters painted bright red, untouched. It wasn't about rules at all. It was about control. And that's when John made his decision. He wasn't going to keep playing defense. If the HOA wanted a war, he would bring the fight to them. He didn't know yet how far they'd go, how much they'd try to break him, or how much his family would have to endure before it was over. But one thing was certain. The Martins were done being victims. And when the counterattack began, nobody in Willow Creek, not even Karen with her iron grip on the neighborhood, was ready for what came next.
John thought he'd seen the worst of it. The letters, the fines, the neighbors turning their backs. But nothing, not even the late-night shadow outside his house, could have prepared him for what happened next. It started with a knock at the door. Early morning, Lisa still in her robe, the kids eating cereal at the kitchen table. John opened the door, and there they were, two uniformed deputies holding a thick envelope. "Mr. Martin?" one of them asked. John nodded. "You've been served." The words hit harder than any fist. Inside that envelope was the HOA's nuclear option, a lawsuit seeking thousands in unpaid fines, plus legal fees, plus the threat of foreclosure if he didn't comply. In black and white, it spelled out what Karen and her board had been planning all along. Not just to punish the Martins, but to break them, to take their home. Lisa's face drained of color as she read the papers. They can't really do this, can they?" John didn't answer, because deep down, he wasn't sure. That night, after the kids were asleep, John sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. Letters, fines, photos, notes. His lawyer had warned him it would be an uphill battle. HOAs thrived on technicalities, on vague bylaws written so they could twist them any way they pleased. But John also had something the HOA didn't: proof. He had photos of non-compliant homes that were never fined. He had recordings from meetings where Karen flat out contradicted herself. And thanks to a neighbor who finally broke the silence, he had an internal email leaked from the board itself, one that said, "We need to make an example out of the Martins." That was the smoking gun, and John knew what he had to do. The showdown came at the quarterly HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a place that usually smelled of coffee and fresh carpet cleaner. But that night, the air was thick with tension. The room was packed, neighbors whispering, curious, some hostile, some supportive. At the front of the room sat the board, and at the center, like a queen on her throne, was Karen. Clipboard ready, glasses perched on her nose, a faint smirk that told John she thought she had already won. "Let's come to order," she said, tapping her pen. John waited until the usual business was out of the way. Budget approvals, landscaping updates, the usual fluff. Then he stood. "I'd like to address the board," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to cut through the murmurs. Karen leaned back, feigning boredom. "Mr. Martin, we've already explained your violations." "No," John interrupted, slapping a folder onto the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot. "You've explained nothing. You've harassed my family, fined us into the ground, and now you're trying to take our home. Tonight, everyone in this room is going to hear the truth."
Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen stiffened. "You're out of order." "No," John said, staring her down. "You are." He pulled out the first photo. A house 2 streets over, with a trampoline visible from the road. "This family's been in violation for 3 years. No fines, no letters." Another photo. Bright red shutters on a home across the cul-de-sac. "Against regulation. No fines. Why?" He laid down letter after letter, violation after violation, each one stacked against the Martins while others were ignored. The neighbors leaned forward, eyes widening as the pattern became impossible to deny. And then John dropped the final piece, the email. He read it out loud, every word echoing in the silent room. "We need to make an example out of the Martins." Gasps, murmurs, heads turning toward the board. Karen's face paled. She reached for her clipboard, but her hands trembled. This isn't about community standards," John said, his voice rising. "This is about control, about targeting one family until their break. Well, we're not breaking. Not today, not ever." The room erupted. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet out of fear began shouting. Some cheered, others demanded answers. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves, but all eyes were on Karen. Her smirk was gone. Karen tried to regain control. She banged her gavel, her voice sharp. "Order! Order! These documents are private. They were obtained illegally." But it was too late. The crowd wasn't listening. Someone shouted, "He's right! They went after him and left us alone." Another yelled, "We've all been scared of speaking up." The tide had turned. And then in a moment John would never forget, one of the board members, a gray-haired man who'd been silent all night, stood up and said, "I'm done," he said simply, tossing his papers onto the table. He walked out. The room erupted again. Karen shouted after him, her voice cracking, but the damage was done. The board was fracturing. John leaned in close enough for only her to hear. "You tried to make an example out of us. Now you're the example." Her face hardened, but her eyes told the truth. She knew she'd lost. But John wasn't finished. The next morning, he filed a countersuit with his lawyer, not just for harassment, but for selective enforcement and emotional distress. The leaked email became the centerpiece of the case. Local media caught wind, and soon Willow Creek Estates was on the evening news. Cameras rolled outside the community gates. Headlines read, "Homeowner fights back against HOA abuse." Neighbors who had once avoided the Martins now knocked on their door, offering apologies, sharing their own stories, even volunteering as witnesses. The isolation that had crushed them for months was gone, replaced with solidarity. The board tried to circle the wagons, but the pressure was too much. One by one, members resigned. Karen fought the hardest, clinging to her title like a lifeline. But in the end, even she couldn't survive the storm. At the next election, she was voted out, humiliated in front of the very people she once ruled over. And when the gavel finally fell, the lawsuit settled in John's favor. The fines were wiped clean, the swing set stayed, the Martins kept their home. For the first time in months, John stood in his backyard watching his kids laugh on the swings, the golden retriever barking happily at their heels. But the victory wasn't just for his family. It was for every neighbor who had been silenced, every homeowner who had lived in fear of a letter in their mailbox. Willow Creek would never be the same. The fight with the HOA had nearly broken him. It cost sleepless nights, tears, and more money than he cared to admit. But as he looked around at the families who now waved from across the street, families who had found their voices because he refused to lose his, John realized something. Sometimes the only way to protect your home is to stand up even when you're standing alone. And in the end, that stand changed everything. Because bullies can only win when people stay silent. And the Martins, they weren't silent anymore.
The night after the vote, the Martins slept better than they had in months. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek, John didn't lie awake, listening for footsteps or wondering what new find might arrive in the morning. The war with the HOA wasn't just over, they had won. But victory didn't come in the form of fireworks or applause. It came slowly, like the first quiet breaths after a storm. The swing set still stood proudly in the backyard. The shutters still gleamed their soft sky blue in the sunlight. The garden, battered but alive, showed new blooms. To anyone passing by, the Martins' house looked like just another home in Willow Creek. But to John and Lisa, it was proof that they had survived. And yet, even in victory, the scars remained. The lawsuit had drained them. Even with the settlement, legal fees had taken a toll. Lisa admitted one night, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, that she'd considered selling the house during the worst of it. "I thought if we left, we could finally breathe again," she confessed. John nodded. He had thought the same thing more than once. But leaving would have meant Karen won. Leaving would have meant giving up not just their home, but their right to live free from fear. And now, looking out at Emily and Jack swinging under the evening sky, John knew they had made the right choice. The Martins stayed. And that choice changed Willow Creek forever. After the board collapsed, neighbors began speaking up. One by one, people came forward with their own stories of intimidation and selective enforcement. A retired couple had been fined thousands over a shed that had been standing for decades. A young family had been told to repaint their house 3 times in 2 years, even though the color was on the approved list. Another man admitted he'd been too afraid to plant flowers in his front yard after Karen once threatened him with daily fines. The Martins had been the first to fight back, but they weren't the last. Inspired by their stand, the community demanded change. A new board was elected, this time filled with people who actually cared about the residents instead of wielding power like a weapon. Meetings transformed from hostile interrogations into real conversations. Rules were reviewed, rewritten, and stripped of the vague, manipulative language that Karen had exploited for years. Transparency replaced secrecy. Fairness replaced favoritism. It didn't happen overnight. Trust, once broken, takes time to heal. But little by little, Willow Creek began to look less like a battlefield and more like the neighborhood the Martins had once dreamed of. And for the first time since moving in, the Martins were no longer outsiders. But the story didn't end there. The media coverage that had once embarrassed the HOA continued to ripple outward. Neighborhoods reached out to John asking how he'd fought back. Letters came in from across the state, even across the country, from people who had suffered under abusive HOAs. Some wanted advice. Some just wanted to thank him for showing it was possible to win. John had never seen himself as an activist. He was just a dad who wanted to protect his family. But suddenly, people were calling him a symbol of resistance. At first, he laughed it off. But then he thought of Karen, standing at that meeting, smirking as she believed she could bulldoze them into submission. He thought of the fear in his children's eyes when they asked if they'd have to move. He thought of every letter, every threat, every sleepless night. And he realized something important. What happened in Willow Creek wasn't just his story. It was a story happening everywhere. So, he started telling it. John agreed to interviews. He spoke at community forums. He wrote an op-ed about homeowners' rights and the dangers of unchecked HOA power. And slowly, his story stopped being just about a swing set. It became a cautionary tale about what happens when rules meant to protect become weapons of control. Lisa supported him, though she sometimes worried he was putting himself back in the spotlight they had fought so hard to escape. But when she saw neighbors planting flowers without fear, when she saw kids playing in yards without worrying about violations, she knew it mattered. The Martins hadn't just saved their home. They had changed the conversation. Of course, not everything was perfect. Some neighbors still whispered, some still avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Change is uncomfortable, and not everyone wanted to admit they had enabled Karen by staying silent. But even those people benefited from the new, fairer system. And as months turned into years, the Martins fight became part of neighborhood lore. A story parents told at block parties. A reminder scribbled into the minutes of board meetings whenever someone suggested a rule that seemed too strict. They'd say, "Remember the Martins," and everyone remembered. For the Martins themselves, the impact was deeply personal. Emily and Jack no longer felt like outcasts. They invited friends over again, their laughter filling the backyard. Lisa's book club grew, women from across the neighborhood gathering in her living room without fear of being reported for too many cars in the driveway. John, once wary every time he pulled into the driveway, now felt pride. This was their home. They had fought for it. They had earned it. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't in Willow Creek at all. It was in John himself. He had entered the fight as a frustrated homeowner, cornered and desperate. He came out of it as someone who had discovered the strength to stand up not just for his family, but for an entire community. It had cost him, yes, but it had also forged him. And he knew deep down that if trouble ever came knocking again, he wouldn't hesitate. Because he had learned the most important lesson of all. Silence is surrender. So what's the takeaway from the Martin story? It's not just that HOAs can abuse power, though they can. It's not just that one person can make a difference, though that's true too. The real lesson is simpler and far more powerful. When you stand your ground, you give others the courage to stand too. The Martins weren't special. They weren't wealthy or politically connected. They were an ordinary family facing extraordinary pressure. What set them apart was that they refused to bend. And because they refused, the entire neighborhood stood a little taller. Their swing set still stands in the backyard, weathered now, its paint fading in the sun. Someday their kids will outgrow it. Someday it will come down. But to the Martins, it will never just be wood and chains and paint. It will always be the symbol of the fight that nearly broke them, and the victory that made them stronger. In the end, the Martins didn't just win back their peace. They redefined what Willow Creek could be. They proved that a home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's the freedom to live without fear. It's the courage to say enough when someone tries to take that away. And perhaps most importantly, they proved that no matter how powerful the clipboard, the bylaws, or the threats might seem, the power of a community, once awakened, is stronger. The Martin story is a reminder to anyone watching. You don't have to accept injustice even when it comes dressed as rules. You don't have to live in fear of letters, fines, or intimidation. You don't have to let someone else decide how you live in your own home. Because sometimes all it takes is one family saying, "Not here, not us." And that one stand can change everything.